Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Ethan Knight, and I work with Western Water Assessment here at the University of Colorado Boulder. In this webinar, researcher Emily Peters will cover findings from her thesis research that she conducted as an Environment, Natural Resources, and Society graduate student at the University of Wyoming. The discussion of results will cover climate-related hazard impacts and key factors tied to rurality that determine how impacts are experienced and perceived. Before we get started, I want to share a bit about Western Water Assessment for those of you who have not worked with us in the past. Western Water Assessment is an applied research program that produces usable science to help address real-world climate problems. We're based at the University of Colorado Boulder, University of Utah, and University of Wyoming, and we work in the Intermountain West, specifically Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. Western Water Assessment is one of 13 teams in the NOAA Climate Adaptation Partnerships, or CAP program, formerly known as the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, or RISA program. Next slide. At Western Water Assessment, we're working to build resiliency in water systems and communities in our region while working on many climate-related issues, ranging from water resource management, drought, climate adaptation, to resilience and compound hazards. The next slide. Western Water Assessment differs from a traditional research program because our goal is to produce usable science that helps address real-world climate problems by directly working with communities, resource managers, nonprofits, and other partners to tailor our work to their needs or priorities. This sometimes takes shape as original research, and other times involves research integration, including things like workshops, webinars, online tools and resources, or technical reports like climate summaries and assessments. Other times it involves providing expertise or presenting at a community or a partner meeting. Next slide. We can connect across a number of activities listed on this slide, including climate information synthesis and tools, vulnerability and adaptation exploration, connecting with partners, and more. If you are interested in connecting with us, you can email us at wwa@colorado.edu. Today's presentation will be recorded and lasts about 20 to 25 minutes, followed by Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A window below. We'll be sure to share a link to the recording with you once it's up on our website. And before I hand it over, please be sure to take our quick survey before you leave today's webinar. It should only take 1 to 2 minutes of your time, and it'll help us plan new webinars and communicate with our funders about our program's impact. I will leave a link in the chat window now, and I'll send it out again at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll hand it off to Emily. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ethan, and hello, everybody. Again, my name is Emily, and today we'll be discussing some findings from my thesis research at the University of Wyoming, entitled Climate Change in the Cowboy State, Risk Perceptions in Rural Wyoming Counties. So just a bit of an overview of what I'll be discussing today. First, I will have an introduction where I put Wyoming in context to the issue of climate change. I will go a little bit into my study background for my research, and then findings from this research, and then implications of these findings for other rural areas in the Western United States. So first, why is climate change important to Wyoming? Wyoming possesses a unique set of factors that influence how human populations experience climate change and adapt to it. To understand this, it's important to put Wyoming in context. So rurality, Wyoming is a very rural state. It has the lowest population and second lowest density nationwide. It has a high percentage of public land. Over half of its land base is made up of federal and state land. Additionally, it has a high socioeconomic and cultural dependence on natural resources, including a significant energy economy, which produces high amounts of coal, natural gas, oil, and soda ash, earning the rank as the second highest energy-intensive state economy in the United States, which is incredibly tied to the availability of federal lands. Additionally, it has a growing recreation and tourism economy. In 2021, it produced roughly $5.8 billion of revenue. Agriculture is also essential in the state, with activities such as cattle ranching and production of crops like wheat, barley, and sugar beets. And it is also unique in its political identity. According to a 2016 Gallup poll, 41% of Wyoming residents identified as conservative, earning it the rank as the most conservative state nationwide. In addition, it is characterized as having an individualistic political culture that is generally just distrustful of federal government influence. So, what do these factors have to do with climate change exactly? So, Wyoming's characterization as rural has been shown to produce a greater risk to the impacts of climate change due to a variety of factors, which include less effective emergency response systems, limited access to medical care, and minimal and aging infrastructure. Additionally, demographic trends in rural areas also indicate lower rates of employment, slow population growth, and higher levels of poverty in comparison to urban areas. These trends are evident in Wyoming when in the last decade, slow economic growth, loss of job opportunities, and the outmigration of young adults in labor force persist. Wyoming's high percentage of public lands increases human susceptibility when federal management decisions restrict access of leases for land-based livelihoods, which is only expected to worsen as climate change is expected to increase conflict over land use. Wyoming's high socioeconomic and cultural dependence on natural resources make populations susceptible to climate change impacts, threatening their health, safety, and ability to earn a living when they can't access the ecosystems that they rely upon. Finally, Wyoming's combined characterization as politically conservative, individualistic, and in a rural context has produced high levels of climate skepticism. Only 58% of Wyoming residents believe that climate change is happening in comparison to the national average of 72%. However, it's important to note that this might be due to a variety of factors, such as the fact that rural voters often feel isolated from policy debates and unfairly blamed by conservation groups for climate change when they feel like they have contributed the least to the issue. Also, national and global trends of declining fossil fuel consumption, particularly coal, represents a significant cause of Wyoming's socioeconomic challenges in recent decades. With this context in mind, I think Dr. Brian Schuman from the University of Wyoming summarizes this quite well, saying that Wyoming represents the tensions between societal perceptions, the important economic role of fossil fuels, and the risk that economically significant climate change impacts have already begun. So climate change in Wyoming, what do we already know? From the research, there's indication that Wyoming has already experienced roughly 2.5 degrees of warming since the start of the 20th century, which as the result has caused shifts to annual snowfall and snowpack and glacial recession, which in effect has produced lower availability of ground and surface water. This is particularly concerning in the state of Wyoming, which is a headwater state that multiple downstream states and tribal nations rely upon. Additionally, Wyoming has experienced extensive forest losses triggered by pine beetles and pathogens, an expansion of invasive grasses, declining habitat suitability and mortality of wildlife, increasing severity and frequency of hazard events such as drought, fires, floods, and extreme winds, among others. So why is this research important? Although there's some knowledge to demonstrate the biophysical and ecological impacts of climate change in the state, there's still a need to understand how humans are experiencing and perceiving impact, particularly as rural and disadvantaged communities may be experiencing high degrees of social and economic vulnerability. Additionally, the experience of risk to climate change is highly dependent on contextual and subjective factors. And I noted earlier about some of the factors in Wyoming that may be affecting people's perceived risk to climate change. With this in mind, it should be of note that when people do not make the connection between climate change and local impacts, they may be less likely to perceive climate as a risk and act on potential response measures, which can have direct repercussions for the extent of impact on social systems. Then finally, although there are some previous examples of research investigating climate risk perception in rural contexts, these are often studied in the global South and within the United States. These are largely focused on rural and natural resource dependent contexts that are focused on agricultural communities. So this project looks at the perceptions of participants in rural and disadvantaged counties in Wyoming to understand the ways people are experiencing risk to climate change related hazards. To answer these questions posed in the research, I used the following methods. Study counties were selected by measures of disadvantage from the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool created by the US government's Council of Environmental Quality, and census tract measures of rurality, resulting in the selection of 4 key counties, including Carbon, Fremont, Sweetwater, and Teton County. Additionally, with this, I conducted 20 qualitative interviews, 5 in each county, in order to gauge people's perceived risk of climate change in their counties. Participants were selected from local organizations, governments, and agencies if they had prior knowledge of climate-related hazards, disadvantaged populations, and adaptation efforts taking place in their communities. Additionally, I used a theoretical framing of risk, which connects experiences of hazards to climate change in a way that is more politically sensitive, and also focuses on people's experience. Well, I did focus on theory of risk to understand my research. I focused more on applied outcomes and not necessarily progressing this theory. Unfortunately, I can't get into a deep dive of the conceptual representation of risk, but just to give some more context for my research, I present here Byner's conceptual model of risk. So for this research, I focus on risk as a function of both a hazard event and human vulnerability or susceptibility to it. With the context of climate change, if risk is the potential for loss, vulnerability is a condition of an individual or population that increases that risk. As Byner et al. Puts, in the context of the assessment of climate impacts, the term risk often is used to refer to the potential for adverse consequences of a climate-related hazard, of adaptation or mitigation to such a hazard on lives, livelihoods, health and well-being, ecosystems and species, economic, social and cultural assets, services, and infrastructure. So as I noted earlier, I selected 4 study counties for this research. These were Carbon County, Fremont County, Sweetwater County, Teton County. And each county displayed existing disadvantages and factors of rurality, which include and are certainly not limited to negative population growth rates, history of legacy pollution, high unemployment rates, extreme income inequality, and high percentages of public lands. So the results from my interviews. A brief summary of these findings. So participants in these interviews noted that they perceived fire, drought, and floods among the most concerning hazard events in their communities, and often discussed risk within these contexts. Also, perceived risk. Interviewees across the study counties often perceive these impacts in relation to broader and longer term social and economic vulnerabilities within their counties. And according to participant perceptions, the built environment, power over land and water, and economic dependencies on natural resources were some of the greatest determinants of risk in each county. These often were often influenced by rurality, which supports prior work finding that the assumptions that climate impacts rural areas uniformly are erroneous and may exacerbate inequalities. So first, the role of the built environment. Results from my interviews illustrated that the built environment plays a critical role in the risk of populations to climate-related hazard impacts. Risk in this case was mediated by factors related to rurality, such as unprepared or dilapidated infrastructure and dependence on external resources and high and low volume roadways that are ill-equipped for increasingly hazardous conditions. For example, in Carbon County, failing municipal water storage systems in the city of Rawlins, which were neglected over a long period of time, in combination with a prolonged drought event, resulted in the Rawlins water crisis, leaving residents without water for days and exacerbating existing concerns about the availability of water. Additionally, this in combination with factors such as historical marginalization caused residents to be differentially at risk to climate and related hazard events, usually by being unable to access quality infrastructure. For example, participants noted that private and public buildings and residential housing were unprepared for increasingly hazardous conditions. This, in combination with factors of historical marginalization, such as lower income populations being forced to reside in high exposure areas such as the wildland urban interface and floodplain, creates factors of unequal risk. I think this is well put by one Teton County participant who noted, there's people who have no choice because of their economic status. They're forced to rent in places that might be in the floodplain or might be in the wildland urban interface. People have to be prepared. They can lose everything. So the role of power, control of land and water. Conflicts over land and water resources were cited as a consistent theme by participants in the differential risk of populations to changing ecological conditions and climate-related hazard events were exacerbated by differential levels of power. Based off of participants' perceptions, power influenced risk by limiting people's ability to access critical natural resources, which was often mediated by factors such as political isolation and exploitation related to rurality and historical marginalization. For example, I focus on a prolonged drought event, which results in water drawdowns in Sweetwater County, specifically of the Flaming Gorge, to meet downstream users' needs. Speaks to the power relevant to water law and prior appropriations. So in Sweetwater County, much of the water has been appropriated after 1971, which in comparison to more urban downstream users who have senior water rights indicate differential levels of power. However, in comparison to prolonged droughts resulting in water restrictions on the Wind River Reservation, this really highlights the role of environmental racism and discriminatory policy that has developed since the time of settler colonization, leading to the beneficial uses of tribes being restricted by the High Court of the state and affecting the ability of tribal members to receive the water that is within their senior water rights. This is highlighted by one Fremont County participant who notes, our tribal water gets sent north of the reservation to farms for non-Indians, and we're always put on water restrictions in the summertime. That doesn't make sense to me because we have senior water rights, but we don't get the water that we need. Highlighting the Sweetwater County example, one participant noted, the ability of the lower Colorado region to make a call on Wyoming water would have a huge impact, not on just individuals, but on economics, employment, agriculture, everything in Southwest Wyoming. Finally, facing economic uncertainties, dependence on natural resources. So economic and livelihood dependencies on natural resources influence risk in relation to climate-related hazard events by amplifying pre-existing economic uncertainties and vulnerabilities, particularly in rural communities who rely on these resources directly, and thus decreasing the capacity for these communities to cope with uncertainties. For example, pressure on recreation and tourism industries for economic diversification in the face of declining fossil fuel industries in combination with reported hazard events such as fire, drought, and floods was noted over and over again by participants as leading to loss of available recreation services, which then places further strain on economic diversification efforts and the ability for these communities to cope with them. These factors influence who and how rural people experience risk by layering long-standing vulnerabilities with more direct climate impacts like altered and changing natural resources that communities rely upon. One Fremont County participant highlights this, saying, the most impactful is the chronic long-term issue of wildfire smoke and what that does in terms of health and recreation when that's a primary core component of this community in the county. So what implications do these findings have for other rural areas in the Western United States? So first, access to land and water is critical for rural communities. Climate response work in rural areas needs to acknowledge the differential access to land and water as key resources, which can create heterogeneity and vulnerability in these communities at a local scale. Additionally, there should be more emphasis on increasing awareness for how rural communities are being impacted by climate change, due to the fact that rural regions often receive less attention given their lower populations, but it's still critical to understand how they uniquely experience risk as it differs from urban counterparts and is a common type of community in the Western US. And then finally, infrastructure resilience. As I noted, rural communities often lack redundancy in their infrastructure, particularly in water storage and roadways. And creating plans for system backups may be critical for increasing resilience in the long term. That's it for my presentation today. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions folks might have. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. That was great. I'll give it a minute to let some questions roll in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ethan, would you like me to stop sharing my screen or?
Oh, no, it's fine. You can leave that up.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. I guess I can start off with a question for you. Are there any examples of success stories for building resilience in the case studies and interviews?
Yeah, and that's something I wish I had more time to get in depth about. Yeah, so I was really at awe with how much like resilience and self-reliance that a lot of these communities had. And there's already so many, I think, local, like small scale adaptation efforts, as well as mitigation efforts happening. So I've been seeing across the state, municipalities have been putting plans in place for both emission reductions efforts and hazard mitigation efforts. I've been seeing a lot of work done in terms of hazard mitigation as well through infrastructure projects such as berm building, things of that nature. And then also just like individuals doing really hard work to bring more water into their communities through water hauling. It's kind of all over the board, but I was really inspired to hear from people's individuals' experience and how they're trying to spread that on a larger scale.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I'll give it one more minute here. There's no questions so far. Yeah. Okay. Here's a question. Do they feel like there is hope that risk will be reduced, or are they resigned to continued life the way it is?
Hmm. No, I don't think so. I think what I found, discussing climate change is a challenge in Wyoming. But one thing that really stuck out to me is I had an interviewee that said, thank you so much for talking with us. And thank you for not trying to kind of debate about what the cause of climate change is. We notice that there are changes happening in our communities, and we know that we need to make a shift. And I think that there are folks that are ready to make active efforts to change, particularly at a local scale. And that may not be in the traditional way we view things. It might be through smaller scale, like actions through agriculture or habitat resilience. But I think folks are finding ways to make it work within the context of the state and the political nature of climate change, to do things on a smaller scale. And there's also all these efforts that have been happening through social and economic organizations. I know, for instance, in Teton County, where there's so many issues with income inequality, people are putting a lot of thought into how that's going to work with climate change. And on a municipal level, I know they've installed folks who are trying to combine their knowledge of climate change efforts with other social and economic uncertainties. So I think people are finding creative ways to change in the face of impacts. And I don't think people are just, from the people I talk to, I don't think people are just sitting with their arms in the air hoping, just saying, well, guess this is what it is. So.
Great. Next question is, what do you believe is the best method of communication of climate change risks with skeptics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think climate change can be important to everybody. I think it does get complicated when we use the term climate change, particularly in Wyoming, but and that's why I focus more on the hazards view of climate change, right? But I think personalizing it, particularly when we're looking at things like on an economic scale, I think people really care about being able to support their way of life, which unfortunately comes down to their ability to earn a living. So I think when we frame climate change related impacts in a way that is personal to their ability to do that, they're more open to the discussion, as well as not so much focusing on, well, okay, what's causing climate change, more making it about real, like on the ground, tangible impacts that they're seeing on a daily, day-to-day basis, and making it really relevant to them.
That's great. Thank you. How much similarity or diversity in perspective did you see across Wyoming's various rural communities about the impacts and adaptation or mitigation to climate change?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. And I will say, like, as I noted, like on a broader scale, like very much people's concern related to whatever like social and economic vulnerability was happening in their counties, which like there was consistency across the board. So people talked a lot about the loss of oil and gas industries and how losing natural resources would affect their ability to do alternative economies, such as focusing on recreation. I think I saw that in every county. I saw a huge emphasis on that. I think, however, I think there were some differences, such as within Fremont County. I also talked to folks who had association with the Wind River Reservation, and there's a stark difference in what the experience is just on the Wind River Reservation versus the county as a whole. So much more of the issues were focused on the long-term effects of marginalization on the tribes at the Wind River versus like some more economically focused impacts within Fremont County. And I think the adaptations that people were searching for kind of matched up with those concerns, right? But I think there were core themes across, but again, each place is different, and that's why it's so critical that we focus on a local scale and make sure that people from communities are heard, because all their day-to-day experiences are different, but within that we can find commonality.
Right. Next question. Were you able to speak with any water districts or water administrators regarding the future of water availability and how best to address plans for resiliency towards climate change issues?
Ooh, I did not speak with anybody from water districts specifically. I spoke from folks from conservation districts, folks from all sorts of different organizations. And, you know, water wasn't necessarily their specialty, but it was certainly something everybody was concerned about. And my expertise on water is, you know, minimal. So it's still hard for me to understand water law, but I think there's a lot of folks who want to take kind of creative approaches to navigating water law, and the increasing lack of availability of water. I know on the Wind River Reservation, there's a lot of work for the tribes to gain more sovereignty over their water, and they're putting plans in place for their own water storage units. I think, again, that's very dependent on the place. And I'm not sure if I have any broad scale recommendations on how we can all adapt to those changes. But I think at a local scale, there are people who are very concerned and trying to adapt accordingly. And I think that does get quite political in some areas.
Awesome, thanks. Next one. If only about 50% of people in Wyoming believe in climate change, what do the rest think is happening? Do you think they attribute the changes to management? For an example, like California isn't managing their forests well, and that's what's causing fires and wildfire smoke.
Sure, yeah. And wow, that's an interesting question. You know, and I do want to be clear on, you know, only 50% believe in climate change. And again, I think one could argue that maybe they don't believe in maybe the way climate change is discussed. But I think a lot of people are aware that there are changes. I don't think I've spoken with enough people to be able to say what the rest of the population thinks. But I do think a lot of it is attributed to politics. I think a lot of it is attributed to poor management. And I think it's easy to blame things on a more federal level. However, I can't speak broadly for half of the state, unfortunately, but I could come up with a few guesses. But I do think that is a largely political answer. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Will your work be published somewhere so it can potentially be cited in Rural Communities chapter of the next National Climate Assessment?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for asking. So it is currently in the process of being reviewed by the journal Climatic Change. I am happy to give updates on whether or not it gets published. At the very least, if that process does not pan out, we're hoping to get this paper maybe published as a white paper. So hopefully something will come out within the next couple of months.
Awesome. Thanks. Next question. Could you share more about what you heard related to the energy transition, extraction industries, and recreation?
Sure, yeah. So I would say at differential levels, of course, but each county was people from each county were extremely concerned with the energy transition, and which I think has changed a lot of my view about the energy transition. I think there's a large call for a just transition, particularly in these rural areas, losing, for example, in Sweetwater County, there's discussion of the Jim Bridger power plant, which is uses a lot of water from the Green River, is expected to close, I think, around 2030 or so. And that's very concerning for communities because much of their jobs are reliant, and there's alternatives such as like recreation on the Flaming Gorge, which is within Sweetwater County. However, in recent decades, as I noted, like there's been the threat of water drawdowns. They had an extreme drought a few years ago where their marina was facing closure. So there's not a lot of outs. People don't feel like there's a lot of outs unless we do more to protect natural resources and provide alternatives for recreation. But again, climate change threatens all those things. So yeah, I think something that people noted was, Bill Gates is having that big plant pop up. I can't remember which county here in Wyoming, but it's in like southwestern Wyoming, that kind of area. And that's been like a huge lifesaver for a lot of the communities there because they were losing their industries and nobody knew what to do. And that contributes to a lot of outmigration. Then there's a loss of social services. And it's just a cascade of negative events. So I think at the core of that is finding alternative ways for for economies. I know that a lot of people understand like that this is a shift that needs to happen, but at the expense of people's livelihoods, it's very serious.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
I think we will wrap up the Q&A now. It looks like there's no more questions. So thank you so much to everybody for asking your questions. And thank you, Emily, for your wonderful presentation. And if we didn't get to any questions or you didn't have a chance to ask them, feel free to email us at wwa@colorado.edu. And remember, I'll be posting a recording of the webinar on our website, and I'll send everybody who registered as well the link when it's posted. And yeah, in the meantime, just email us if you want to keep the conversation going. And remember to take the quick survey, if you will, in the chat. I believe Benet posted it. So yeah, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.